From Rome, from the Auditorium Antonianum, good afternoon, one and all. For some of you, it's good morning. For others, it's good evening. A very cordial greeting to all of you who follow us live, online, from many countries, and listen in various different languages. Thank you for joining us in the presentation of the latest document published by our dicastery, the Congregation for Institutes of Consecrated Life and Societies of Apostolic Life. The document has as its title, The Gift of Fidelity, the Joy of Perseverance. And its subtitle is Remain in My Love. It appears in the category of guidelines. As the term itself suggests, it's a text that is intended to guide each consecrated person, each consecrated man and each consecrated woman, as well as entire communities along the path of fidelity and perseverance. The presentation of this document was scheduled some months ago, but on account of the pandemic, we have had to postpone it. And so now we are proceeding with this presentation in this new online mode. Much pain has been caused by this terrible pandemic, especially on account of human losses. The social distancing which we have experienced and continue to endure has led us to become ever more familiar with information technology, and therefore allows us to proceed with a presentation of this type through live online streaming that allows a wider dissemination, but perhaps it leaves us somewhat distant and far away. Surely those of us who are present here are sad, regret not being able to see you, to meet you, to see your faces, to listen to your reflections and questions. And that is why, almost as a continuation of this meeting, we have scheduled a next appointment. We have scheduled another appointment for February of 2021. Now, coming back to the document, I believe it's important for me to remind you that it is the result of the plenary of the dicastery, which took place in 2017, to deal, and certainly not without concern, with fidelity and abandonment. The objective was to provide a picture of the phenomenon and to set guidelines to somehow curb it. Participating in this meeting are Cardinal João Bras de Avis, Prefect of the Dicastery, His Excellency José Rodrigues Carvalho, Archbishop Secretary, Father Pierluigi Nava, Undersecretary. Also, we will be assisted in getting to know the document from different angles by Professor Maurizio Chiodi and Professor Luigi Sabarese. So without further ado, I wish to give the floor to His Eminence, the Cardinal Prefect, who will introduce this presentation. His Eminence has the floor. Well, warm greetings to each and every one of you. You are scattered across the earth. You're following us from every corner of the earth. In this way, perhaps it's an opportunity for us to establish some kind of contact, a relationship with you, so it is to be closer. We are engaged in the same journey, following in the footsteps of the same God. Perhaps what we should meditate upon when reflecting on fidelity, and this is what I wanted to say in my greetings to you as I think of myself and of you. Fidelity is God's way of being, not ours, but God's way of being. God is faithful. We're not. This fills us with great joy. God, since he uttered his first word, his one and only word through the Son, God has always, always manifested his fidelity to man and to woman. Now, naturally, in God, fidelity is power, but it is a merciful form of power, for God acts out of love. He manifests his power by approaching man and woman, making them creatures as sons and daughters, communities, that they may stay close to him. So the first great truth that we must accept, embrace with complete joy, because really that is what allows us to enter into our poverty. The truth is that God is faithful. History, or rather the history of scriptures, the history of salvation, is the history of God's fidelity. He is faithful. For us, well, there's a word that I came across this beginning of Advent. It was a word that I draw from Saint Cyprian. When Cyprian speaks of faith and hope, Saint Cyprian says that we can really experience the fruits of faith and hope if we are capable of being patient, if we are able to be patient. So this way of considering patience made me rejoice. In us, fidelity is the result of a process, of a journey, filled with beautiful and with terrible and difficult things. At times, these things appear to us as almost impossible, and so we will eventually experience and bear the fruits of a Christian hope and faith. We will attain fidelity if we are capable of staying on the path. Pope Francis tells us from the very outset this very beautiful and simple message. It's beautiful, it's wonderful that we can stay where we are, remain where we are, because if we go away, God will come back to comfort us, but will not find us. He can comfort us. He can show his love for us if we remain there where he called us. Patience in these times of change, of pandemic, is what will really help us to generate fidelity once again, a fidelity that will be typical of this time, that will bear the traits and features of this time, and especially it will have the trait, the feature of being closer, of approaching the experience of God. In order for this to happen, we have to have the courage to come back to what Pope Francis says about first love, our first love, where you're passionate, where you see nothing but that one great love out of the grace of God. By listening earnestly to your heart, you feel, you experience God's presence, God's nearness, and you feel that God loves you, loves us unto the death. Now, consecrated life, all of us together are called to embrace this time, this moment. We see that for our fidelity, this experience of God, of God's fidelity, must come back to us, must return in us, and it should take on the characteristics not just of the past, but of the current times with its sensitivities, with its specificities. And so, as well, our congregation, the sickle cell, and you all, we are all convinced that the area in which we really need to focus is formation. That's what we really need to focus on, formation. formation and education that is to lead to two essential results. First of all, it is called to allow, to bring forth in the person who is called the disciple of Jesus. The disciple of Jesus is to be formed, is to take shape. Formators, masters, and mistresses of formation must believe, must think that the persons that are entrusted to them for formation and with whom they will experience and witness this journey of formation, they also need to be people who are becoming ever more disciples of Jesus. So that's the first step, which is ever eternal. In order to enter into the fidelity of God, this is the first step. After listening carefully to the times in which we live, not just the past. That's not what we're called to hold on to. We have to hold on to what is essential from the past, but we mustn't think that the present doesn't have something very strong to give us in terms of our capacity and our sensitivity, in our willingness to follow God. We need to grasp all the signs that come our way so that this language of our response to God's fidelity is a response that can really help us go forth. I am ever so pleased for your presence. We're so happy that we can come together in this very different way. Here in Rome, we're in a conference room where in the past there were 600 people gathered together. Today there are 10 of us, but you're out there. We can't see you, but we can feel you, and we want to be with you, instruments of this reflection, and so as to open up these new paths, paths that perhaps we are already familiar with and that we need to deepen. So you're most welcome from all of us. Something by way of support and help in this journey can come forth. And I am certain that this will be a very fruitful afternoon. Thank you, Cardinal, for your words, which are always so close to us. And you have wisely introduced our reflection with your very close words. The first step in our journey is a presentation that is going to be made by the Archbishop Secretary, who will speak of fidelity and perseverance as challenges to the meaning of the consecrated life. Your Excellency, you have the floor. Good morning, good afternoon, good night. I, too, like His Eminence the Cardinal Prefect and Sister Carmen, Undersecretary of our dicastery, wish to welcome you all. Now, I have been asked to speak about fidelity and perseverance, challenges to the meaning of the consecrated life. Now, for some time now, we have been hearing about crises in and of the religious and the consecrated life. To justify this diagnosis, often one recurs to the number of dropouts, of abandonments, which strikes a great number of institutes, and if things continue this way, seriously challenges or undermines the very survival of some institutes, not of the consecrated life, but of some institutes. Now, I'm not going to discuss here whether the crisis that we're talking about is something good or something not so good, is positive or not, and if the numbers per se is a symptom or are a symptom as to the greater charismatic relevance or in those who have it, or in those who don't have it, is a symptom of lack of fidelity to one's charism, as is often stated. Now, I would just like to invite us all to engage in a very serene and detailed analysis, which takes into account the various different situations so that we do not follow, or rather fall into into the trap of being very generic in our reflection and departing from reality. What is sure is that the phenomenon of abandonments is very worrisome, is a source of great concern. On the other hand, the very fact that this bloodlet of abandonments, of dropouts, continues without stopping goes to show that we are confronted with a broader crisis, which really challenges some concrete forms of consecrated life. Now, whilst we admit that the phenomenon is complex, personally speaking, I don't want to consider so many abandonments as normal. And also, I refuse to consider the social and cultural influences on people, on the consecrated life as the one and only cause. In the face of this phenomenon, as they say in my country, it is necessary to grab the bull by the horns and to address the topic face on with a very clear-mindedness and with great courage in order to draw the conclusions, to reckon with the consequences, and take the steps necessary to stop this bloodletting, so as to avoid the religious and consecrated life from losing its vitality and energy. Fidelity and perseverance go together. Now, from the title of the document that we're presenting this afternoon, you get a clear sense that fidelity cannot be separated from perseverance. They're sisters that walk hand in hand. They're two sides of the same coin. One should say that fidelity is a gift of God, and it is fully manifested in Christ. It is the fruit of the Holy Spirit, whereas perseverance is the faithful response in time unto the end, up until the end, up until Sister Death comes to pay us a visit. So it is a persevering fidelity. As the scriptures say, it is maintained in evidence, in proof. It is accompanied, it occurs in love and is accompanied by gratitude. The scriptures provide us with some tips, some indications. In order to maintain a fidelity and perseverance, the scriptures tell us that we should cherish the word, listening to it with a heart that is whole and good, as Mary did. Secondly, we must keep our hearts and minds fixed on him, just as the branches are united to the vine. And then prayer, constant, not occasional prayer, as Jesus demanded of us. And then memory and hope. Now, I would like to very briefly stop here. Pope Francis says, as I also would say, a people that has no memory, has no present, no future. An institute that has no memory, doesn't have a present, doesn't have a future. We must look We must preserve our memory, but this memory must not be a sterile exercise in archaeology. The Pope tells us that it must be a Deuteronomic memory. It renders what we recall relevant, topical, in our case, the charism, and then hope. Hope. I would like to quote the last homily of Pope Benedict in February of 2013, just before he stepped down from the papacy. Do not listen, he said, do not listen to the prophets of doom. Pay no heed to the prophets of doom who cry everywhere, always, that the consecrated life is at an end. Keep watch. Be watchful. Be hopeful. Hopeful. We are hopeful because we know that God does not forsake his people, as the first reading of today reminded us as well. Now, let us try to analyze the crisis. I've identified 4 areas: motivations, affectivity, conflicts, religiosity. Now, when motivations are in crisis, there are 2 different types of motivation. Of course, I'm being extremely succinct here, very brief and to the point. When motivations are lacking and when motivations instead help to grow, those that are the former respond to needs, to necessities, to gratification, and those instead that proceed in the direction of growth are motivated by faith. So motivations that have to do with something that's missing, and motivations that have something to do with the desire to growth. Now, unless our motivations are rooted in faith, sooner or later, our motivations are bound to come to an end, and hence resulting in an abandonment of the religious life. The other area is that of affectivity. We can consider affectivity in relation to ourselves and with the authorities. In relation with ourselves, affectivity in relation to us can be manifested in dissociation or escape for fear of diversity. And it can also manifest itself in aggression. Now, one of the manifestations of aggression is, of course, abuse. The abuses that have so deeply wounded society and the church. And in relation with authority, affectivity can enter into crisis, and this is made manifest by submitting blindly. In my short experience in the dicastery, I can tell you that this is a real danger, and partly also to do with the fact that authority often becomes authoritarianism. So we need to be careful not to submit blindly in the name of obedience. That is not evangelical obedience, the obedience of the consecrated life. And this simply creates a dependency, and we're seeing this more and more, and even onto plagiarism. But at times it is manifested in an aggressive rebellion, and it can go so far as to take the form of sentiments of aversion and rejection of any form of authority. Whilst a blind subjection can never be justified, the latter cannot be justified either from our position as consecrated men and women. A third area is conflicts. Now, conflicts can be faced through a passive adaptation or with a responsible commitment. If we face conflict passively, we run the risk of getting stuck in the face of conflicts, and we run the risk of experiencing permanent, ongoing frustration, whereas if instead we face conflict with responsibility, conflicts can help us to grow intellectually, effectively, and no doubt can help us to grow in our personality based on a project of life. And finally, when religiosity is in crisis, according to Freud, religiosity is the ultimate compulsive neurosis. It is an external factor that is motivated by the quest for, the search for support or defense and protection. The attitude, according to Freud, is egocentric, exhibitionistic, utilitaristic, and narcissistic. But humanistic existential psychology tells us that religiosity is an aspect, a component of personality. It is a dynamics that favors growth, maturity, mental health, the search for the ultimate meaning of life. Of course, here a first question arises. Religiosity. Is my religiosity as it is described by Freud or as it is described by humanistic existential psychology? Well, we are approaching numbers. We're getting closer to numbers and figures. Now, on this slide, you can see the dicasteries that are competent for the religious and those who have the figures at hand, who know what the numbers of abandonments are. First of all, our congregation, the sickle cell, the vast majority of consecrated people refer to us. And then we have the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples. The religious or consecrated people of missionary institutes refer to it. And then we have the Congregation for Eastern Churches. Under it are the Eastern Institutes, and then the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Well, so far, the Ecclesia Dei Commission refers to it. It gathers together a certain number of institutes of consecrated life, and then finally the Congregation for the Clergy. And some dispensations refer to it, as we will see later. Let's look at the numbers. Let's look at the figures. Here they are. You can see here the number over the years. Now, I'd like to bring to your attention the fact that today, the number is just a little below that of 2016. But our forecasts as of the 31st of December, we're not there yet, but we have made a projection based on the figures as of November 30th. It should be in the range of 1,862 abandonments. These are the numbers that we handle, our congregation, and then I'll tell you another number, another figure. So not 3,000, by no means, absolutely not. You have the number here in front of you. We're in the range of 1,862 and more, as you will see later. Now, the type of dropouts as of November 30th, 2020. Dismissal ipso facto, 67. Confirmation of the decree of dismissal, 206. Incarnation ad experimentum, 122. These are all numbers of 2020. Incarnation pure et simpliciter, 144, and a dispensation from vows, women's and men's, 1,180. Now, my attention is drawn by the confirmation of decrees of dismissal. So dismissals and dismissals ipso facto. We're in the range of somewhat 200, almost 300, almost 300. They've grown substantially in these past years, and especially this year. Possibly the motu proprio of Pope Francis, Vita Communis, is also bearing fruit, is also yielding results. Let's look at the countries. What are the countries in which we have the highest number of abandonments? Of course, we can't cover all the countries. That wouldn't be possible, but the major ones. India is at the top of the list. It is the country in which we have the highest number of abandonments, 204, followed by Brazil, Mexico, Italy, Poland, the Philippines, Colombia, Spain, Peru, the United States, Argentina, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Indonesia, and so on. I can also tell you that taking into account, bearing in mind the figures of other years, the positions remain more or less the same. And more. Another figure which should be borne in mind, dispensations from the priesthood. These are dealt with by the Congregation for the Clergy. This morning, I was given these figures. Now, they are not included in the figures that I presented before because they are dealt with directly by the Congregation for the Clergy, for they entail dispensation from the priesthood or diaconate. So from this year, we have 353. Now, some are repeated because there's an agreement between our two congregations, ours and that of the clergy. Sometimes when a dispensation from vows is requested, we, after having heard the major superiors, we can come to the conclusion that the causes are so serious as to recommend the dispensation from priesthood or from deaconship directly the clergy. But anyway, these are the figures. The causes for abandonments. Based on the figures we have at hand, the leading cause for years now has been the lack of spiritual life, which is manifested through the lack of personal prayer, absence from community prayer, a superficiality in the sacramental life, and a greater focus on activities. The second cause is the loss of a sense of belonging. This has a lot to do with fraternal life and community. And so we have lack of affection, losing affection towards the local community, the institute, the church, scarce participation in community moments, in community events, and in the initiatives of the community, and also a certain imbalance, lack of balance between community and personal needs. Now, usually in these cases, the community is regarded only as an instrument to satisfy one's needs. Lodging, so the religious house becomes like a hotel and a restaurant. Financial support, legal aid, legal support, and then eventually these are people who leave the communities. And that is why the Holy Father issued the motu proprio. At times, the leaving the institute is not lawfully decided. Otherwise, other times it is. For example, some people leave temporarily in order to assist one's parents, and this is happening more and more, and it affects the contemplative life. Now, if one leaves for a very long period of time, one eventually loses one's attachment and affection towards one's community. Another cause, affective issues. Issues having to do with affection or affectivity. I've just list here a few. When they fall in love and eventually marry, the violation of the vow of chastity, which does not necessarily result in marriage, nor does it automatically result in abandonment. Eventually, it leads to abandonment. Heterosexual/homosexual acts. And then again, affective problems that have repercussions on the community life. Some have said that 99% of community life issues, of problems with community life, have to do with affection, not sexual, but affective problems, problems having to do with relationships, with relatedness, relational conflicts of various levels. Now, of course, this order that I have just presented, well, some might say, that's not what the papers say. It's true. It's true. It's not exactly what we read in the documents, because usually what the papers tell us is that the leading cause is that people fall in love or have affective problems. But if you read those papers carefully, if you read the reports of the general curious or that are sent to the general curious or to the dicastery, if you read those reports carefully, you can see that there are, in most cases, precedents having to do with spirituality or issues having to do with one's spiritual life or issues having to do with fraternal life in community, problems in establishing relationships. And what I have said is confirmed by many studies that have been conducted. Now, if we look for an explanation for abandonment, the society from which our young people come might have something to do with it. I don't need to go into this because my description would be exceedingly biased. I can't list here all the advantages of today's society because we're looking at the causes that can account for abandonments, and therefore I'm listing here only the negative elements, such as postmodernity, a world that is rapidly changing, cultural changes, complexity, various different models of life and behaviors, a lack of orientation, uncertainties, doubts, a lack of clear points of reference focusing on the here and now and on emotions, difficulties in distinguishing between what is truly essential and what is not. The time of market approach. Everything is measured on the basis of utility and profit. Zapping, multitasking, a superficial mentality, dominating subjectivism, individualism. The young people who come to us come knocking on our doors, coming from this culture. Many of them are also victims of subjectivism themselves. They have difficulty in posing fundamental transcendental questions. They engage in and embrace part-time culture. The Pope describes this in an interview/book that was published 2 years ago. It has been published in many different languages. Maybe you've read it already. And basically, he tells a story here of when he was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and a young person went over to him and said, "I want to become a priest." And he said, "Fine, let's see." "Oh, but only for 10 years. And so he answered, "Well, you can't do that." But, this whole issue of the part-time culture is very much in vogue. So our young people oftentimes really embrace this culture, and they're influenced by their family. Now, personally, I think that the real great challenge does not lie in the consecrated and even the priestly life. It's a personal matter. The real crisis is to be found in families. That's where it originates. Oftentimes, one might say that it is a miracle that from certain models of households and families, vocations may actually arise. So the influences coming from the family, from one's peers, from the culture of what is temporary or /light. Well, one might want to ask, however, what about us? What should we say about the institutes of religious life, institutes that welcome young people? There is indeed an institutional emergency. In many cases, there is an emergency. The more vocations some institutes believe, the better. But that's not good. I'm reminded of number 38 of a document that was issued by our dicastery some time ago, starting afresh from Christ. We say here that we cannot allow ourselves to be tempted. We cannot give in to the temptation of the number of efficacy. Otherwise, discernment will be based on numbers and institutional emergencies. Abandonments, as was said previously by the prefect, really question formation. They bring into question formation. Formation must foster or favor a sure and mature identity, an identity that is not based on that is not archaeological, as it were, something that is set in stone. At times, this actually results in fundamentalism, in sectarianism. We have to be careful of this type of identity that is really set in stone. And also, we have to beware of identities that are dominated by fashion. In the East, they say, if you marry fashion, soon you'll be left a widower. So identity must not be set in stone, but neither must it be dominated or be a response to fashions. And we must also bear in mind that our culture does not help people to make definitive and final decisions. The formation we provide must help people to make free, definitive, irrevocable choices. Of course, we know that that means going against the current, moving against the mainstream. And also a personalized journey. I'd like to address here the contemplative sisters. In the last document of the Church of the dicastery, which is approved by the Holy Father, the process of formation has been extended for them. That's wonderful. We have to be careful not to make our formation programs too short. Shortcuts in life, in information, have never been good news. The model of church, the church model, has an influence. We have to provide a formation in view of a church that is a small remainder. We have to provide formation for a vision of the consecrated life that is no longer at the center, at the heart of the social life. Not even the church. The church is no longer at the heart of social life. And we are called to minority, to accept minority, to embrace it. And the Pope, Pope Benedict, just before stepping down, underscored this with all of us consecrated people. He encouraged us to embrace minority, not privileges, but service, the primacy of God and the incarnated spirituality. Pope Francis underscores this again and again, a spirituality that makes us become, at one and the same time, children of God, of heaven, and children of the earth, prophets and mystics, witnesses and missionaries. Now, we have to be very careful here about the pastoral care of vocations, pastoral ministry. Again, numbers will not save the consecrated life. The evangelical relevance will. And so vocations ministry must be honest. Young people can see whether or not we're being earnest. And also, we need to be demanding. The Pope has reminded us also in the letter that he addressed to us, consecrated people, the gospel is demanding. It is demanding. But beware, it's not rigid. It is not stiff. It is demanding. And quality? And we must also remember that the best way to go is by rendering a witness. Initial formation in the direction of responsibility, to educate to responsibility. Our formees must be able to recognize their own rights, but also their duties. Initial formation must help our formees to learn to love fraternal life in the community. We need to be down to earth. We need to be realistic, but at the same time show the beauty of fraternal life in community. And the vows also. We have to show the beauty of the vows, and at the same time, we need to underscore the needs, the demands, a sober and basic, essential life. Those who promise to be poor cannot have everything at once today. Otherwise, the vow of poverty doesn't mean anything at all. So a sober and basic life, evangelical radicality, and then a strong spirituality. I think that a strong spirituality must be based first on Scripture, the Word, and then on the sacraments, especially the Eucharist and reconciliation. And then on the founding texts, each institute, each society has its own. The authentic devotion to Mary, accepting her as mother and mistress and teacher, so not just a sentimental devotion. The method needs to be personalized, attention to the individual person to overcome a homologous formation that is the same for all, special attention for each individual, careful choice in formation, masters and mistresses. The four characteristics indicated more than once by the Pope. Formators must love young people. A formator who loves can demand. A formator who does not love cannot and must not demand anything of anyone. Actually, he should just step down. And then formators must love their institute. They must have a sense of belonging to their institute. And then again, they have to have a strong intellectual that they must have a special love for the charism and a special love for the church. But the church, not the ideological church, but the real church that is made of saints and sinners alike. He must love the Peter of today. In the past, Peter was blessed. Today, Peter is Francis. And that has to be very clear in initial formation. And then again, an adequate preparation of formators, especially in the human sphere, human preparation, human formation, human, spiritual, charismatic, intellectual, and pastoral. Formators must also understand, even if they have only one person in formation, they must understand that their priority ministry is formation. They cannot be part-time directors or teachers, hence presence, closeness, listening, sharing. Initial formation must also focus on faith and on sexual affectivity. We have to be very careful here. This can no longer continue to be a taboo, as unfortunately is still the case in many institutes. In the early years of the consecrated life, attention needs to be paid to the crisis of realism, to the disenchantment where perseverance is at stake, special attention not to overload our young people with the tasks and responsibilities, because eventually this will result in activism, and after a few years they'll grow tired and leave. And here it's necessary to pay very close attention to a personalized accompaniment, not just on the part of the formator, but by the entire community. The entire community must provide adequate accompaniment. All members of the community must be able to live their charism with authenticity. Only then will all the members of the community be formators. In the community, there are only two types of religious consecrated people, either formators or not. Your Excellency, you have just a few minutes left. Is it possible to be forever faithful? Well, just look at many consecrated people who live their perseverance, their fidelity with perseverance and joyfully. And I just want to say that perseverance is possible. This is demonstrated by many trees that still stand. A tree that falls makes more noise than a forest that grows silently, right? So let's look to these witnesses of true perseverance. And no doubt, let us turn our gaze to examples of perseverance as I'm sure we all have in our institutes, and as we contemplated just a few days ago by turning our eyes to Mary. To Mary, our mother, we entrust all consecrated men and women that they may persevere in the joy of the vocation they have received. Thank you, and let us forge ahead. The prophet Isaiah today said twice in the first reading, "Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. I am coming." So thank you, and again, have a good morning, afternoon, or evening. Thank you, Monsignor Carvalho. We thank him for dwelling on the causes of abandonment and separation from institutes with an eye to fidelity that should be encouraged as a gift to be welcomed and guaranteed. He has invited us, considering the reality of young people, to allow ourselves to be challenged by the call to joy as a founding reason for fraternal life, a fraternal life in which each one knows how to take care of the other, being aware that we are all custodians of a precious common treasure or heritage. And as a response to the phenomenon of abandonment, he has called us to a formation that expresses our charism with authenticity. And now we come to the second contribution, which broadens our gaze on discernment and the formation of consciences. We therefore wish to welcome and give the floor to Professor Maurizio Chiodi, a professor in moral theology at the Pontifical Theological Institute John Paul II of the Lateran University. Good afternoon to you all who are connected online. Now, you are connected. You're not just an audience. You are people who are actually connected. And very special thanks to His Eminence, Cardinal Davis, and to the Secretary, His Excellency Monsignor Carvalho, who spoke before me. And many thanks also to Sister Carmen and to Father Pierluigi. The document on consecrated life, which we are here to present, the gift of fidelity, the joy of perseverance, as has been mentioned more than once, was born above all as a response to the rise in the phenomenon of abandonment, which at this time significantly also characterizes a consecrated life. It is this painful, exhausting, difficult, and in some respects traumatic experience. Well, this is really up to us. It could actually paradoxically turn into an opportunity, a kairos. Hence, the fundamental intention to give a new evangelical impetus to the consecrated life by rethinking decisive virtues such as fidelity and perseverance. Persevering fidelity. Such a commitment to renewal concerns both the lifestyle of monastic communities, and of all the various forms of consecrated life in the Church, and a personal appropriation, a community life, and a personal life, since the two go together. Now, in my reflection, I would like to focus on three aspects. The first has to do with a short analysis, and I will refer to the text that is going to be published for this, of the culture and customs of today, which His Excellency has in part already identified. And then the second and third points will be dedicated on a reflection on formation and the formation to conscience. And then I will look at the virtues and practices of discernment. Now, I think that a theological reflection on the consecrated life cannot disregard the cultural conditions, the consideration of the cultural conditions that characterize the life experience not only of those who enter the consecrated life, but also of those who, for various reasons, already belong to it and perhaps enter into a crisis of rethinking their choice of life. Culture is not secondary, extrinsic or accessory addition to personal consciousness. In fact, it constitutes the system of customs which gives shape to the human experience of a people and which instructs, shapes, and determines personal conscience. The family itself presupposes culture, since it is marked by it downstream and is introduced to it upstream. Now, the fundamental traits often stressed by you, Your Excellency, as well. Well, as I was saying, often it is said that the Western culture especially is in crisis. Now, you yourself mentioned the words of Benedict XVI and of Pope John before him in the famous Gaudem Mater Ecclesia, the opening address of Vatican II, said that it's necessary to go beyond the prophets of doom, the tones of the so-called prophets of doom, which exposes to the risk of losing the present. In fact, in the Greek etymology of the word, crisis means both decision and judgment. We could say that already here we find a decisive reference to discernment of conscience and formation. Ours is an era of crisis of social custom because nothing goes by itself. Nothing is taken for granted anymore. A decision imposes itself. It's like when one walks along a straight path with no way out, and at one point one comes at a roundabout and one needs to make a choice. You need to decide which way to go, which exit to choose. The theologian, just like all those who have the life of the Church at heart, must show together the ambiguities and the opportunities of the cultural times. Opportunities, well, the opportunities are three. I'd like to list them very quickly. The first is that today, of course, today, where in the face of an opportunity, we can no longer turn to the authority of others to whom we should defer the responsibility of our choices. Autonomy means this: I choose for myself. And again, today, no one can be justified behind, the words, well, we've always done it this way. Also because the great speed of technical and scientific progress have challenged customs that had become sedimented for a long time, and in particular today, reference to the religious tradition, the choice of faith is no longer taken for granted. It is ultimately one of many possible choices. And another opportunity is the rediscovery, reevaluation, and centrality of the subject, which rightly highlights our aspirations, feelings, affections, expectations. Now, these choices, these conditions represent opportunities, but also involve risks. The first risk today is that the personal decision is dictated and almost imposed by the fascination of science and technology. Another risk is that religious faith will be only perceived as something that comes from the past. It will become the refuge of those who nostalgically cling to some compensatory certainty. And another risk is that we might simply center on an idolatry of the ego, so that in the end, decisions will be dictated only by the immediate impulse of affection, by the powerful and fickle thrust of sentiment. And in this case, the moral conscience is absorbed and reduced in the affective conscience, in the way in which one feels. Now, in these cultural conditions, the question arises spontaneously, and which undoubtedly applies to all countries, and to which all cultures must respond with its own responsibilities. Where should we start from? Again, how can we make the most of the opportunities and avoid the risks of our time? Now, these questions in particular concern consecrated life, which, like all significant life choices, is also inevitably marked by the culture of belonging. Now, the path of reflection that I propose in order to answer the proposed question is to concentrate our reflection on the two focuses, which are precisely the formation of consciences and the discernment of affections. These two topics are profoundly intertwined because conscience requires discernment, and discernment shapes a conscience. I would like to remind, to stress that both traits don't just have to do with the Christian and the consecrated life, but rather they have to do with the universal anthropological experience, the experience of what is human and as such belongs to all. And in the consecrated life, we must bear in mind this connection between human and spiritual formation, because without human formation, you fall into a spiritualistic attitude. People who will say, the Lord will take care of all your problems, so place yourself in his hands and everything will be settled. But vice versa, there's the opposite attitude, which is the voluntaristic attitude of those who say or hear themselves saying, well, if you put all your goodwill into it, anything is possible. If you try harder, you can do it. And in either case, the anthropological mediation is skipped, as it were. Because either the experience of the Christian faith is reduced to a disembodied and narrow perspective, or the need to come to terms with actual situations and experiences is ignored. So the second aspect that I would really like to focus on is the formation of consciences against this background, this cultural background, which I have presented in the light, of course, of the Western culture, which I'm most familiar with. The formation of consciences. I would like to be perhaps a little provocative in saying that we do not have a consciousness or conscience. We are conscience. We don't have it. We are it. In other words, conscience coincides with my whole self. It's not a faculty. It's not just a judgment, something that is a theological line that I adopt. It coincides with my identity. So this value, this crucial value, absolutely does not result in relativism or subjectivism, as if we were authorized to do whatever we will. Quite the contrary. Conscience is the moral form of the subject. It is his being, both appeal and response. It is given to him as a gift. We might say that the structure of conscience, of moral conscience, is both, as I said, appeal and response. Appeal for good, response of freedom. So in the conscience is ascribed the appeal of the good that is attested to in this original experience. The experience, say, of being a son, a daughter, being cared for. And through this experience, each of us has has formed the experience of one's identity and dignity. And the vocation to the consecrated life is but a particular form of the vocation that characterizes not only every baptized person, but indeed every human conscience. As we read in Gaudium et Spes 16, the call or appeal resounds in the consciousness, but at the same time it transcends it. For this reason, it has a responsible form. It responds. Just consider what happens from the very origins in man. The mother, the father, lean over the baby and with love and calls the child, inviting the child to respond, to speak. So the first word of the human being is an answer. The child's first word is not I. It is the word that the mother or father addresses to the child, calling it by its name. Or rather, by the name by which they want to be called, a mother or father. So the first word of the child is the one that the mother or the father addresses to him, anticipating the very name which the mother herself or the father is waiting to be called by. Moral conscience is the answer to a voice that calls, urges, moves to act, to response. We are anticipated by a gift, a grace, a promise that opens up a fulfillment, a happiness. So it implies a transcendence, something that is given to you in advance, a promise that is given to you through the good experiences of life. For this, we need to entrust ourselves. I say this from an anthropological standpoint. Good has its reasons, which are not demonstrable or cogent, but they educate you they help you to make a decision. So enduring the good experiences of life instruct actions, as we read in Hebrews 5:8 in relation to Jesus, the child, the son who has learned obedience through experiences. So this allows us to recognize the centrality of experiences and of affects, which testify experiences. I would like to underscore this point. The knowledge of good is not inborn, nor is it simply an intuition that people have upstream. It is given to us through the good experiences of life. So the formation of consciences is much more than theoretical instruction. Forming a conscience is not just about teaching. It's much more than theoretical or intellectual knowledge. A conscience is formed through the good experiences of life from the outset and throughout the course of existence. Now, these experiences of good are always experiences of relatedness within a culture, and this confirms the fact that a conscience is not individualistic, is not solipsistic. It is a relationship. In his difference, the other belongs to me. So I cannot say me without you. It is thanks to you that I can say me. Just think of the importance of the experience of being a son or daughter, and that of being mother or father, fraternity, sorority, friendship. But think of all these experiences, that they all of these experiences have an inescapable social and cultural profile. There is never a direct proximity that is not mediated in an established form. Finally, we must remember that our experiences and actions stretch, all of them, over time, and we ourselves narrate them. We can narrate these experiences. The formation of consciousness, therefore, does not take place in an instant, everything at once, but rather it requires a process which unfolds over time. If we wanted to represent it with a sketch, with a drawing, we would say that it is not on a straight line, but within a network, a fabric, a weave of relationships that are spread over time and space. Sort of what we're doing today, starting from this center, we are relating with each other through a network. So our identity is not static and fixed. It is not substantially defined once and for all. It is constituted in a story of relationships. And it's thanks to this story, or through this story, that stretches between the promise, which anticipates it in the original experiences of good, and the fulfillment, which is inseparably linked to its practical responsibility. So it is within this dramatic story that the light of the gospel is lit, the unique story of this man, Jesus of Nazareth, which presents itself as a fulfillment not only of the promise made to Israel in the law and the prophets, but also of the promise inscribed in the good of experiences of living. So in Jesus, we are all children. The filial experience. We are the sons and daughters of a God who is the Father. He calls us to live as brothers and sisters, and the fullness of time that is fulfilled in Jesus, the proclamation of the kingdom of God, awaits our decision, for it is addressed to us. We are its recipients, and only by dedicating our lives to a cause of good. Consider the parables of the precious pearl. Jesus says in Mark 8:35 that only those who lose their life for their own sake and the gospel in reality lose nothing, but find everything. It is a paradox. Only apparently those who are willing to lose by devoting themselves will find what they had apparently lost. And this fulfillment of the gospel doesn't annul the drama of history, but it renders it possible because it opens up to hope. And this is where we find the radical testimony that is so necessary of the church in the different communities that form it, that constitute it. The church is called to be a place of experience, experience of the good of God in Jesus, a place of fraternity, of good relations, of hospitality, mutual hospitality, of welcome, acceptance, proximity, care, and mutual concern, forgiveness. Now, religious and monastic communities are particularly called to this, and it is not by chance that community life belongs normally to the very structure of monastic and religious life. It's as if to say that the recognition of the one Father is carried out in lived witnesses of fraternal relationships where mutual care, closeness, and solicitude, even in conflict, become for one another the truth of faith in the one Lord. And in all of this, the church is a sacrament of the presence of God that anticipates the eschatological fulfillment. The third point in my reflection has to do with the practice of discernment. The fundamental idea that I would like to suggest here is that discernment is the constitutive, not exceptional, form of every decision of conscience. Now, this statement, in my opinion, is valid from both the anthropological and moral universal profile, as well as from the spiritual profile specific to the Christian, to all. And these two profiles actually coincide they constitute a unicum. Christian discernment implies neither privileges nor shortcuts, nor special revelations. It constitutes the structure of the decision-making process in which the disciple of Jesus concretely realizes his form of human being. Now, the inseparable relationship between the universal anthropological profile and everyone's humanity and the Christian spiritual experience gives me the opportunity to underline the need to overcome the ancient and problematic separation between morals or morality and spirituality. Now, this aspect is underscored in number 59 of the document, which states that discernment is a moral and spiritual category, a point of encounter between morality and spirituality, where the difference, where we see the anthropological and spiritual richness of the person who is called in Christ to bring fruits for the good of the world. Now, the spiritual experience and the experience according to the Spirit of Jesus designates the evangelical profile of the promise that is inscribed in the human experience of all, an experience which finds fulfillment in Jesus. He is the Son that gives us a spirit that we may be sons and daughters. Now, in this spiritual horizon, which is not spiritualistic because it's anthropological, it goes together, here, as I said, I would like to offer a final reflection on this structure or this tradition, rather, called discernment. I would like to recall that in the philosophical tradition and in the theological tradition, starting from the very beginning of the 12th century, of the 13th century, I beg your pardon, what the spiritual tradition called discretio spiritum became prudentia, then enriched by the extraordinary reflection, Aristotelian reflection, which culminates in Thomas's reflection on prudence. So the virtue of prudence and phronesis of Aristotle come into play here. Now, I would like to show how this process is described in the conscience of man with a sort of temporal structure. Every discernment and the very structure of the moral decision, which is discernment and conscience, implies a sort of temporal structure. And there are three passages. Discernment has to do with affects or affections as a promise to be recognized, and then becomes discernment of what is good, which in life sounds like an appeal and which in the norm is formulated. And finally, discernment concerns action, which goes in search of the possible good. So I would like to very briefly go over these three stages. The first is the discernment of affections, and I'd like to underscore number 51. The document that we're presenting states that the initial moment of this self-understanding is a real discernment of affections. Now, at the beginning, there is a discernment of affections because affections tell us or speak to us about God's promise, about His grace, about the evidence of good, which wants to be welcomed and listened to. I would say that the first rule of discernment is that it begins with the interpretation and the intelligent listening to lived experience. In other words, it is in our affects that opportunities or risks are revealed. Just think about fear. It holds us back from a risky situation, or enthusiasm or a drive or a thrust that draws us towards something that is good, that calls us. Now, in our feeling, we see the opportunities, the possibilities, and dangers. In our feeling, we are thus revealed the promise of God with a responsible task that urges our freedom. Our freedom response in the document here, number 53, states that discernment is at the origin of our freedom that responds, a freedom that is responsorial, responsive. I was saying that this first stage is about listening to what happens to us and what is revealed to us by what we feel. All discernments require listening to affects or affections, and this is not a secondary or banal step. The events of life are not merely facts, raw facts, nor are they a spectacle to behold in an impersonal manner as if we're to make something become fossilized. Events touch us through the mediation of feeling, and by feeling we discover all. We get to know everything. And so our knowledge begins with affects. Our emotions are not at all the contrary of reason. We might say that nothing is more intelligent than affections, and nothing is more effective than reason. Like when a professor, a teacher who is amusing makes us enjoy even very difficult subject matters. And so we can really address the question that is raised by our affects. What is the good that they promise? And knowing that God's own promise, His will for good for us is revealed to us through our feelings. All of this requires a discernment of affections, and in fact, affections are varied, and just as varied and exuberant as life. At times they may even seem contradictory to us. I could be both attracted and repelled by situations and circumstances, events and people and relationships. According to the famous interpretation of Saint Ignatius, we could say that our feelings are a bearer of a twofold movement, which we synthesize in desolation and consolation, sadness or hope, fear or faith. And precisely because of their heterogeneity, affections require discernment between what one should avoid and what instead deserves to be embraced, also through difficulties and resistance and obstacles, long mediations and strategies. The second moment is that of discernment of the good, which begins with listening to affections and feelings. It wants to be expressed through words, and this occurs in dialogue, in the encounter with the other. Now, although one cannot make a clear distinction between the dialogue with oneself and with others, because all our relations with ourselves are also mediated by the encounter with the other, but here I would like to focus on the fact that a good discernment of affects is not just based on a dialogue with oneself, but requires a dialogue with others. And this is absolutely crucial. It's between us and ourselves is always the other. With reference to the consecrated life, the important tradition of accompaniment, spiritual accompaniment, has always been underscored in this direction, entrusting to others frankly with great trust one's story. And that is crucial in order to reach one's own synthesis, one's own personal spiritual appropriation and self-understanding. And it's, of course, indispensable in the dialogue with others, and this happens very frankly, all the more frankly, our affections receive words. They acquire a face and a name, and all this allows us to decipher them in a deeper way than when we remain simply within ourselves. The word itself, the word we say to the other, shapes our self-understanding as we tell ourselves. And in this dialogue, it thus becomes possible to understand what is good and what is evil, the good and the bad that is at stake in our particular history and in the decisions that we're called to make. And it is at this level that moral norms are given, and they're necessary and inseparable link to the promise of good. The norms that lend words to the experience of the good, they cherish them, that we may walk along this path towards what is good. And in this way, norms and rules urges us to the good that deserves to be wanted, and at the same time warns us of what would make us lose the promise that is given to us by these relationships and life. And in this sense, all norms have a fundamental dialogical value because they formulate the meaning of relationships and lend words to this common good. And I'd like to conclude with a brief reference to the third step or stage, the discernment of affections, the discernment through dialogue for the discover of the universal good that is at stake in your personal history, as it is attested in norms. And thirdly, the discernment of the possible good. Referring here, of course, to a notion that is dear to Pope Francis and that is extremely important in the moral and spiritual life and the human life. The universal good and the dialogical norm cannot remain at an abstract level. Access to them is given only in the concrete experiences of the lived experience of conscience, and therefore the good it is this concrete experience that the virtuous process of discernment inevitably returns. This is precisely the moment of decision when it is a question of determining the action to be taken. Here, discernment draws its climax from the very beginning of the first feeling, was prefigured. Now, in this sense, the moment of decision is the peak of this process of discernment. It is evident that not every choice and not every action have the same value and the same weight in personal life. And amongst all choices, choices of life, they have a particular importance because they're unique. But they are nonetheless particular. The choice of undertaking, of persevering, or leaving the consecrated life belongs to the number of life choices which represent a decisive investment in one's personal life because they're hugely important. And in that choice, my identity, myself are at stake, and no life choice coincides with the totality of self because no choice absolutely guarantees or vice versa definitively compromises one's faith if it's just the choice of a status. We are called every day to respond to the calls of life, to God's call in our story. And these choices find a particular place in the choices of life. So every choice requires discernment, and this applies all the more so to life choices, including that of consecration, religious consecration. The necessary discernment in this choice, the good that we are to want, is never absolute or never ideal in the form it takes. It requires rather a mediation that is a discretio, a discernment, a capacity that is for distinction, and where it's a matter of taking into account the goods at stake, the priorities, the urgent needs, and the risks and inevitable ambiguities. The times, just consider that a hasty decision rushes discernment and is not wise. A clear decision, which, however, is constantly put off, might vice versa result in even greater situations of even greater risk and danger. And so human choices always require an assessment and evaluation of the good that's at stake. In human choices, there is never a clear alternative between light and dark, black and white. The colors of life involve shades, hues, gradations, and for this, they require the ability for wise discernment. Practical judgment always has to do with the possible good here and now, which is a true middle road, not a trivial or banal compromise between the excesses of utopian idealism and disenchanted cynicism, in which everything is justified. And to conclude, the choice of discernment in the final analysis has to do with this ongoing search for the concrete forms of good, which in our temporary and itinerant human condition as viatores, people who are journeying, keep us on our way towards the fulfillment of the promise that God has already made for us, predestining us in Christ, in the fullness of his life. And this predestination only awaits, this is decisive, our response in order to be effectively fulfilled. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Professor Chiodi, for emphasizing or underscoring conscience as the relationship in which grace is at work and the importance of its formation. With your words, you have opened our gaze to contemporary reality in which the gospel calls or challenges conscience, the subject and a place of discernment, and has opened it to trust and a dialogue with the God of the covenant, a God that calls us every day to respond to life's calls. Thank you. Very well. We now have a 15-minute break. At 5 o'clock Italian time, sharp, we will reconvene. Depending on the country you're in, you can no doubt go and have some coffee or tea or mate. Basically, time for a break. Thank you.
Riprendiamo ora il nostro itinerario.
We resume our work, guided by Professor Luigi Sabarese, professor at the Faculty of Canon Law at the Pontifical Urbaniana University. Professor Sabarese also will dwell on discernment, but he will address it in the light of accompaniment, with a particular focus on the normative paths and the practice of the dicastery. Cordial greetings to you all, and thanks to the dicastery for inviting me to prepare and to share these reflections with you. Talking about the separation from an institute, even within the normative paths, is an unattractive subject. Trying to say something about the practice of the dicastery is a very difficult subject indeed. Perhaps it is more appropriate than ever to at least point out that norms and practices acquire greater significance also in the light of a path of discernment and accompaniment. The speakers before me have already underscored the importance of this binary. Every discernment indicates an operation that leads to separation, and this process of critical analysis and discernment inevitably leads to a choice, to a decision, which involves accompaniment in its various phases. Now, against this background, everything that refers to the separation of members from an institute of consecrated life or from a society of apostolic life may perhaps also be more understandable. Having said that, it seems appropriate to introduce ourselves to the subject by spending a few words on the gift of fidelity and the joy of perseverance. Having done this, I will try to make a first reflection on the practice of our dicastery, and then on the practice of the Roman Curia in relation to the norm. And finally, if I have enough time, I will highlight the normative innovations and the practice of the dicastery which have been incorporated into the third part of the document that we are presenting this afternoon. The vocation to the consecrated life is a free gift of God, but even more precious is the gift of fidelity. The institute of separation may be better understood if it is placed within the context of fidelity and perseverance. Now, there is a fatigue of a discipleship which requires careful discernment and accompaniment, taking up the systematic code, the guidelines go over the normative guidelines, or rather norms, but enrich it with elements of practice in use within the directory. Hence, the title of the third part of the guidelines, the separation from the institute, canonical regulations, and dicasteral practice. Now, this part will occupy our reflection, and the first point that I would like to dwell on at greater length wants to be an attempt to offer a reflection on the practice. In number 62 of the guidelines, we read that tradition, universal and proper law, and the practice of the sickle cell of the congregation have over time issued guidelines, provisions, and norms for the protection of fidelity and consistency with the obligations deriving from the status of consecrated person. Under the Code of 17, the dicastery had intervened in some cases on the subject of separation from the institute. I quote here two interventions that help to understand the text of the intervention in their context, so as to give some elements to identify how the practice of the dicastery was formed. Now, the first intervention is dated March 2nd, 1974, and it has concerns the processus indicialis concerning the resignation of perpetually professed religious in an exempt clerical institute, as was the wording at the time. The practice is made public through the form of the decree, which within it specifies how the practice has developed and formed. The content of the decree is decided unanimously during a plenary session of the dicastery. The prefect of the dicastery submits the decision of the plenary session to the Pope, who ratifies it, confirms it, and orders its promulgation. The second intervention that I'd like to mention here concerns the regulations issued in 1975 to regulate the procedure for the dismissal of religious women in perpetual vows. The text specifies the procedure step by step. In other words, the canonical admonitions, the stages of the process or procedure, and the transmission of the acts to the competent dicastery. In response to a request from the Apostolic Signature regarding the legal value of this text, the prefect of our dicastery explains that the text, which takes into account the case law of the Signatura regarding dismissals, is intended to be a subsidy, a tool provided to women's institutes lacking adequate legal preparation to facilitate the solution of very difficult situations. The norms in question are the result of a practice matured over the past few years. Quoting the answer of the dicastery. After the entry into force of the current code, only one case is known in which the dicastery intervened with the so-called policy address document. I am referring here to the document Dans sa maternelle on the procedure for the separation of a member from the Institute dating June 1984, which, above and beyond the juridical qualification, in the bulletin Informationes Scris appears under the heading Decisions and Guidelines. Well, anyway, the document underscores that the Code of 83 specifies what was already ordinary practice, namely the transmission to the Holy See or to the bishop of the request for separation presented by the rapporteur to the legitimate superior with his personal judgment, his or her personal judgment, and that of his or her counselors. Now, in addition to the reception of the new canonical norms introduced by the recent motu proprio Communis Vita and the Cor Orans, the intention of the guidelines is to make known the practice of the dicastery for the consecrated life. And so here we delve into the midst of our reflection. What can and what should be understood by the practice of a dicastery, and what is its relationship with the norm? It seems no less important to relate to the practice, the norm, and the rule. The guidelines frame precisely the final part of which they are constituted within the context of the rules. I'm quoting number 64, rules which are precious resources for formation to fidelity. And in the light of the discipline, which can be synthetically understood as the art of the disciple. The rule can be described as a guide, a standard of behavior. At the origins of the charism of some masters and founders, the charism crystallizes in a rule that becomes a point of reference for future generations, even if the semantic evolution of the rule doesn't mean only the written one as we are currently led to understand it today. So how can we understand the rule today? A twofold movement can be enlightening. From us to the rule, to the following of Christ, from following of Christ to a form of life adapted to this vocation and shaped into a rule. It is only in modern law that institutes distinguish between constitutions and rules, and although a certain jurisprudential orientation has attempted to reserve the term rules to the ancient orders, the modern congregations don't lack the use of the term rules of life to understand the constitutions. Now, this denomination seems to correspond more to the constitutions that were updated after Vatican II. Now, on the concept of praxis, both in a general sense as a praxis of the Roman Curia and in a more specific sense as attributed to a single dicastery, the canon literature is quite absent, and where present, it is not very homogeneous. In a more generous way, the doctrine has been spent on the activity of the apostolic courts, the tribunals, and their decisions, which, however, more properly make jurisprudence. In the pre-code doctrine, there's a case in which the jurisprudence of the then Congregation of the Religious speaks about the interventions of the dicastery in the life of individual religions, societies, and institutes. It should be remembered that immediately after the First General Congress on the States of Perfection held in Rome in 1950, the then Holy Congregation established the Practical School. In the founding decree, the words are significant, reminding us that the dicastery must not only form and instruct the students as to the style, practice, and procedure, but also as to the jurisprudence of the dicastery itself. However, there is a praxis judicialis, or an administrative praxis, but there's a praxis of the Roman Curia or of the dicasteries as individually. If so, in either case, how can it be qualified? What are the distinctive features? In our case, is there a praxis or even a jurisprudence? Now, starting from the elementary and yet fundamental consideration that law is not an exact science, that the jus dicere is an expression of jurisprudentia, and that there may be different solutions to the same issue, it is important to know what these different solutions are and how to choose between them. In processual matrimonialist matters, praxis is also used to indicate constant jurisprudence. However, it is now essential to keep administrative practice separate from judicial practice. And within each of these, formal practice, which is the usual requirements to proceed to the formation of acts and the transmission of decisions, for material practice, that is, the ordinary evaluation criterion according to which certain matters are resolved. Now, praxis Romanae Curiae, mentioned together with jurisprudentia, is used in Canon 19, that is, in the context of legal gaps. The content of the notion of praxis should therefore be explained in the context of a supplicatory source, according to what the legislator has understood, placing our institute in Canon 19. The notion of practice, nevertheless, is not exclusively linked to the context of the Lacune Legis. In fact, the Code of 83 understands, as part of the concept of practice, both the principles governing the formal production of acts and the content of decisions taken in the exercise of the administrative function. In any case, as is the case with jurisprudence, a certain repetition of acts is also required here in order to be able to speak of practice. Now, no doubt, one single act is not sufficient, nor one or more acts by individuals reasonably opposed by the superiors of a dicastery. In fact, the practice should increasingly take the form of a continuous mode of resolving government issues that are the responsibility of the executive authority and which is based on a line marked by previous guidelines and decisions. from which criteria for resolving similar cases are derived, both in the case of substitution, supplencia of Canon 19, and outside of it. In general, precisely because administrative acts express and are based on a wide margin of discretion on the part of superiors, it's a good idea that they're made aware of the practical guidelines they subscribe to, and that the latter are part of consolidated procedures for resolving a given issue. And in this way, this actually makes it clear that the notion of praxis curiae not only differs from jurisprudence, but also from customary law. Authoritative doctrine has in fact pointed out that praxis does not derive from the consent of the community as with custom, nor above all is it formed in accordance with the material criterion, so to speak, of the repetition of acts. In this regard, it can be observed in general terms that the higher the authority that indicates a resolution, the more the resolution may become a practice. For example, plenary within a dicastery, entrusting a case to a commission of cardinals, referring a case to the supreme authority of the Holy Father. The doctrine also points out that practice takes on a particular meaning and value when certain acts are made public, for example, through the publication in the Acta Apostolicae Sedis. And this modality confirms authority on that act and indicates as an example for practice in other curias of the Church. A real problem is still that sometimes the elements that make up praxis curia are not given adequate publicity. Such a lack is limiting, especially for the effectiveness of the praxis in the context of Canon 19, that is, as a supplicatory source in the case of lacuna legis. In fact, this is necessary since the legislator intended to confer the value of a supplicatory source of law in a universal context only to the praxis curia romane. But the praxis curia has not only a supplicatory value within the meaning of Canon 19, especially for the actions of government of lower instances, which shouldn't derive from it without adequate, if not prevalent, reason. It's also valid for the dicastery itself, which is bound by its own resolutions in subsequent cases similar to those already dealt with, unless different reasons suggest different guidelines. Well, what should be said instead when within the Roman Curia the praxis enters into a collision course, as it were, and in any case in contradiction with a resolution of a different nature and value, for example, with an authentic interpretation given by one dicastery before which another dicastery opposes a different practice. It's hardly the case to mention in this context the practice that our dicastery follows regarding the application of the authentic answer concerning Canon 127 to its own sphere regulated by Canon 622, paragraph 1. This way of proceeding leaves several questions open. The practice of an individual dicastery and its resolutions must be assessed individually. Shouldn't each dicastery be presented in a greater unity within the Roman Curia with a view to achieving a certain administrative unity as well? A greater coordination between dicasteries is always more desirable, not less than difficult. And finally, it shouldn't be forgotten that as decisions are produced as a result of the judicial control exercised on administrative acts, jurisprudence in the strict sense, that is, the judicial one, must prevail over the practice of the bodies holding executive power. Now, in order not to always be limited to a deductive activity of the legal criteria that can be derived from the practice of the Roman Curia, it is appropriate that they be collected and expressly formulated. Our congregation has intended to proceed precisely in this sense. For example, with the guidelines of 2018, Economy at the Service of the Charism and Mission, particularly in the operative instructions, and from numbers from 50 to 97, and with the present guidelines in Part 3 of the third part that we're dealing with, it has provided a concrete example of how to proceed in order to formulate a certain practice. Part 2 of my presentation, which I will briefly focus on, focuses on the new regulations within the dicastery's practices. The new regulations have innovated the code or derogated from it, and they concern essentially three cases that have been covered by the guidelines. The illegitimate absence of 12 months of untraceable religious in the context of the absence from the religious house with a motu proprio, communis vito. The exclustration of nuns with the cor orans instruction, and the ipso facto dismissal for illegitimate absence of a religious person who is unavailable for 12 continuous months. I am not going to list all details, but there are a few elements that deserve to be underscored. Alongside the new regulations, the guidelines contain, as mentioned previously, indications of a different nature that go beyond the regulatory framework and belong more directly to the sphere of practice. So, in addition to what is already known by code disposition, here, we highlight the aspects that qualify the guidelines in some practical indications that would represent the dicastery's way of acting, plus some suggestions of a more prudential nature. I'd like to indicate the case of legitimate absence from the religious house. The guidelines give explicit indications in the document of legitimate absence, indications that specify the religious's contacts with the institute, the exercise of rights, possible financial assistance. Now, in the case of failure to fulfill the duties proper to the state of consecrated life or in conduct, the competent superior may take corrective measures. Now, also for legitimate absence, precisely because it is legitimate, there have to be reasons which need to be specific, and the concession of absence is granted for a limited period of time. In order to foster mutual relations between the major superiors and the ordinaries, the local ordinaries, the major superiors should inform the bishop, but also, if necessary, by sending a copy of the indult with the clauses. And when it is the case of a cleric who is legitimately absent, the bishop must be informed. I will limit myself to mentioning some novelties relating to a few individual cases. In particular, on the dismissal from the Institute number 80. Under this paragraph, the guidelines cover four different cases, four different types of dismissal: ipso facto, compulsory dismissal, dismissal at the discretion of the superiors, and dismissal following immediate expulsion. Now, it is useful here to underscore that immediate expulsion is not in itself a dismissal. Expulsion must be followed by the procedure for deciding on dismissal. And in fact, Canon 703 provides that the major superior should instruct the process of dismissal or refer the matter to the Holy See. As for dismissal ipso facto, referred to in number 81 of the guidelines, the guidelines take up the new case of illegitimate absence from the religious house for more than a year, and the indications of the circular letter regarding the concept of a person who is available and person who is not available, who can be traced or who cannot be traced. They indicate the process to be followed for the declaration of dismissal ipso facto and the procedure for declaring the illegitimate absence from the religious house for more than a year. It is very important is the clarification that we read in number 85 in cases of dismissal ipso facto, the concomitant declaration of censorship late sententia of suspension for clerics and for non-clerics, as well as the declaration of irregularities in the exercise of the sacred order for clerics and irregularities in the reception of the orders for non-clerics. As for the remission of the censorship of the suspension and the dispensation from irregularity, it's a clerical. It is necessary to turn to if it's a clerical settled, resigned, dismissed ipso facto, and incarnated in a diocese. If it's a non-clerical who's been subject to the interdict late sententia for an attack or even a civil marriage, he must abstain the prior remission of the censorship so that the valid celebration of the canonical marriage may also be lawful. Now, it's interesting to look at the some particular issues. As for abortion, it is accompanied by excommunication late sententia, in which both the woman who voluntarily submits herself to it and those who cooperate physically or morally, directly and effectively. Regarding the case of the concubinage of a cleric, it's described as a more uxoria, relationship characterized by a certain stability even without cohabitation under the same roof. Concubinage and the scandalous permanence of a cleric in a state of external sin entail the prohibition to lawfully celebrate the Eucharist and the prohibition to access Holy Communion, as already indicated in Canons 900, paragraph 2, and 915, respectively. As for the very, very delicate and complicated cases of abuse on minors committed by religious, if the accused religious is a cleric, the Supreme Tribunal of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith has competence. If the religious is not a cleric, it is the sickle cell that has a competence over these cases. The latter, as we read in number 91 of our guidelines, has established a specific commission for such cases. With regard to the procedure for a compulsory dismissal, it should be borne in mind that while the procedure in criminal cases is subject to a 3-year period, limitation period, except for the exceptions expressly indicated in the code, in disciplinary actions, there's no limitation period, and therefore disciplinary action must always be instructed. The supreme moderator, with his council of at least 4 members, votes collegially. An absolute majority by secret vote is sufficient to decide on the dismissal. And finally, a word on optional dismissal. Among the cases that the Code presents by way of example, the guidelines inform that in this case, Obstinate disobedience and unlawful absence are frequent in practice, as we see in number 93. As far as canonical admonitions are concerned, the guidelines insist that their formal drafting be taken care of. Clear, brief, first and second admonitions have the same content, including the legal grounds, the exposition of the facts, and the device. The admonitions must express the religious right to defend himself before the major superior who initiated the trial or the process, or directly before the supreme moderator. The admonitions must be notified with proof of receipt. It is important to bear in mind that between the sending of one admonition and the sending of the next, at least 15 days or a different time established by the admonition must elapse within which to comply with the precept contained therein. This period may be longer than 15 days, but not shorter, and begins to run from the day of notification of the admonition, that is, from when it was received by the member, and not from when it was issued by the major superior, nor from when it was sent, or from a different time established by the admonition itself. The decree of dismissal is and remains an act of the competent major superior. The dicastery, the pontifical dicastery, or the bishop of the house of inscription for the religious of an institute of diocesan law does no more than confirm the decree. So these are just a few examples to show how the guidelines made a remarkable effort towards combining the norms of the code and its practice, thereby making it public. Just a word by way of conclusion. With all the difficulties advanced at the beginning regarding the nature, the identity, and the role of the practice, the guidelines have nevertheless attempted to offer some practical aspects in use at the dicastery when dealing with the various forms of separation from an institute. Already with reference to the systematic codes, in spite of the simplification of the subject matters, there have been items in doctrine or voices rather in doctrine and practice that have denounced the need for greater clarification. We can reasonably think that the same can occur with respect to these guidelines. Among the many aspects that can be perfected, the guidelines certainly wanted to provide clear indications in order to evaluate more accurately the causes underlying the request for separation in its various forms, in order to be able to clearly identify whether to suggest a simple absence, exclaustration, or even definitive dismissal. From this point of view, it seems important for the superiors to make an even more in-depth discernment of the causes and of their seriousness, and therefore of the true possibility of overcoming them, in order to be able to suggest to the religious concerned the most correct, canonical, and effective way to resolve the personal situation with a view to full reintegration into the religious state, or possibly a definitive exit. Thank you. I would like to thank you all for your kind attention. Thank you, Professor Sabarese, for the specific attention to the new canonical norms and to the juridical aspects of the dicastral practice relating to the separation from the Institute, a phenomenon to be read always within the framework of the gift of fidelity and the joy of perseverance, with the hope of a deeper discernment by the superiors. The Undersecretary, Father Pierluigi Nava, will now offer some conclusive remarks. Cordial greetings to everyone. What do we mean by conclusive remarks? Well, some specifications regarding the scope of the document. Manete in dilezione mea, remain in my heart. What is the first ecclesial perspective? The documents produced by the dicastery form part of a process of discernment that is, first of all, geared towards assessing the credibility and reliability of the witness of consecrated men and women in the church, an assessment and evaluation which currently reckons with what has been referred to as a crisis of surrendering one's life to God, not only in acknowledging one's own limits, limits to one's own freedom, but obviously also the fragilities and vulnerabilities, and finally in the commitment, the ethical commitment of keeping one's word, the crisis of being able to keep one's word. I'm referring to vows and other sacred bonds. In particular, in order to make the best possible use of our time, we have spoken of an ecclesial horizon. In what current horizon of the life of our church and of the consecrated life should the document Manete in dilezione me be regarded? Just very quickly, I would like to underscore the sense of the guidelines, which was mentioned already when presenting the document New Wine and New Wineskins. We could say many, many things about the sense of direction. And here, instead, we simply want to underscore that the guidelines want to be a contribution, a subsidy, an aid to the governance of an institute, in other words, the sense of direction. And why do we wish to take that direction? Well, the guidelines that have been presented today are meant to interpret the emergency of abandonments and separations from institutes and societies based on the following question, which I consider to be crucial. The question as to the sense of identity, vocation to the consecrated life in the church. And therefore to raise once again the question regarding the sense, the meaning of fidelity and perseverance of consecrated men and women within the current cultural and ecclesial context. Also, the guidelines are meant to, or have intended to, go over the processes of formation as processes of formation of conscience and of discernment. Also, the guidelines have attempted to rediscover fraternal life and community as a place of formation to prevention, to accompaniment, and to solidarity in moments of difficulty. And the text of the guidelines have also attempted to offer normative pathways based on the code, legislation, and on the praxis of the dicastery as an integral part of the processes of discernment in cases of separation and abandonment of the institute or society, which I consider to be absolutely crucial. Now, that very, very briefly says something about the scope and the meaning of these guidelines. There's a second point that I would like to underscore, having to do with the title. There's almost an echo, an echo, an assonance of inspiration, which draws inspiration from the language of the Scripture, the gift of fidelity, charis, reference to charis, grace, gift of fidelity, the joy of perseverance, chara, chara in Greek. The phrase "manete in dilectione mea," remain in my life, is the introduction which identifies the document, and within the context is consequential to the title. Grace, the gift of fidelity, cherishes in us the joy of perseverance in order to remain in the agape of the Lord. Consequently, what follows is a sequence of three key words: charis, chara, agape, grace, joy, love, which ideally represent the red thread in the narrative and witness of a life consecrated in fidelity and perseverance. So what prospects have these guidelines opened up for us? The document, as was already mentioned in the first presentation made by the Archbishop's secretary and in the introduction to our gathering, in which the grace of fidelity and of beings of the Lord, as His Eminence said. Anyway, the document does not want to focus only on the phenomenon of abandonments. Indeed, this was already mentioned. A reading of statistics as presented by the Archbishop's secretary, no doubt, is an alarm of the malaise in consecrated men and women, the diagnosis of which can never be hasty or superficial. So those who have the ministry of discernment and personal accompaniment must never lose sight of what the document repeats over and over again. That is, that what they are doing is a service to the Church, and within the Church, a service to the consecrated life. Perhaps more worrisome are signs of indifference towards the phenomenon, creeping the fact that one has become accustomed to it and simply resign oneself to it. Perhaps the problem is no longer a problem, or no longer regarded as a problem. So if on the one hand, what emerges, no doubt, is a certain fragility and instability of our institutions, both phenomena have no doubt an impact on how the faithful perceive the consecrated life, and not just not just with, and this of course has negative repercussions on the choices of vocational orientation. Now, whilst resignation cannot be the answer, the reaction, the document clearly brings to the fore formation of consciences in the dialogue of discernment, gift and responsibility at one and the same time. Examination and formation of conscience entail or exercises of discernment, thanks also to the complementary contribution of the disciplines of psychology, which question as to the meaning of formation in the consecrated life, perhaps in overcoming certain traditional parameters of reference, credibility and reliability nowadays call for the responsibility in formation and consequently the witness of consecrated men and women. The guidelines have therefore raised a question for formation without intending to provide ready-made solutions or fixed solutions to curb the phenomenon of abandonments. Indeed, we are reliable together in the grace of fidelity, and likewise, we are credible together in the joy of perseverance. So, addressing, as was done in the document presented today, fidelity and perseverance, bringing them to the fore together means rekindling the awareness, and you know that, the rekindling the awareness in converting oneself to discipleship, this awareness that is rooted in the rule of life, which is proposed to the consecrated men and women during formation, not simply in reference to sanctions or disciplinary measures, but with a view towards taking on responsibilities also before or in the face of one's failures and infidelities. Now, more concretely, it wants to educate to the sense of responsibility that forms a consistency of life. And the third part, canon norms and dicastery practices could recover and consolidated direction, and as mentioned by Professor Sabarrese, rereading the situations and problems that are arising. The experience of discernment is sedimented, as to speak, so to speak, in the praxis of a dicastery, but it is an experience that is open to what is new, to the future. It is an experience that also raises questions in order to provide adequate answers. The document, in referring to what all the speakers, from the cardinal, the prefect, Professors Chiodi and Sabarrese, have focused on the fact that the document is part of a process of continuity of the dicastery's production in the wake of the council and post-council magisterium. And very briefly, the guidelines would like for people to become aware of the phenomenon of abandonments, to challenge, to bring forth a question regarding fidelity and perseverance in the processes of formation and in the subsequent experiences of community and mission of consecrated men and women. One final word on the slide that you see behind me, quoting the words of Pope Francis, taken from the text, The Force of Vocation. The Pope says that, I believe that on the basis of every true option of consecrated life are these words: walk in my presence and be whole. Genesis 17:1. Thank you all for your kind attention. Thank you, Father Naba. Thank you for these insights, and thank you all. I would like to thank those who have spoken, those who have listened and followed with interest and patience. And before concluding, I would like to take up what I said at the beginning. The second part of this presentation will be a new meeting with the superiors and the general procurators. And for this reason, we invite them to send us by email any questions or doubts regarding this topic. We ask you to do this by January 10th, because our dialogue will take place on February the 18th. We would also like to remind you that the recording of this presentation remains on the YouTube channel of the Dicastery, or you can also see it again using today's link. The proceedings of this event will be published in Sequela Christi. And we end this moment with the prayer to Mary, faithful and persevering woman. To Mary, our mother, the faithful woman who desires the fidelity of her sons and daughters in the response of love and total dedication to Christ, we entrust all consecrated men and women so that they may persevere in the joy of the vocation received. Mary, faithful woman, you were docile in welcoming the Spirit of truth that proceeds from the Father through your Son, Jesus. Teach us to preserve the gift of a vocation and to rediscover its vitality day by day. We look to you to contemplate God's work, which renews our ability to love and heals our wounded fidelity.
Persevering in following, watchful guardian and lover in the world, to contemplate the blessedness of those who through fidelity.
Te miramos,
We look to you, persevering at the foot of the cross, to stand beside the infinite crosses of the world, where Christ is still crucified in the poor and the abandoned, to bring comfort and support. We look to you, persevering with the apostles in prayer, to burn with the love that never goes out, to walk in joy, and to face defeats and disappointments without anxiety. Mary, faithful woman, pray for us, obtain for us from your Son and our Redeemer a living and loving faith, a humble and industrious charity, to live the gift of fidelity in perseverance, humble and joyful seal of hope. Amen. And to all of those, all of you who were with us, to your communities, wherever you are, we ask Monsignor Carballo, His Excellency, and I, we want to ask the Lord that he may help us at this time. I think that we have begun this process of reflection at a time of great anxiety for all of us, at a time in which we really are called to stop and reflect. There is a great desire to further deepen our experience of God, who always looks to us with mercy, with benevolence, even if a father or mother were to abandon us in our life, God will never abandon us. He is always faithful. May he bless us that we may forge ahead. And to all of you who spent these hours with us with great gratitude, we thank you and prepare the second part of this meeting in February. And in this way, we are putting into practice what together we have decided on when we had our assembly in order to be able to go ahead based on decisions made together. May the Lord be with you. May he bless you, the God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Many, many thanks to you all. Thank you, Eminence, and thank you all.